My name is Chris Serpenon, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at the University of New Orleans and the director of the Tocqueville Project on democratic ideals and institutions. Today, I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Robert George to the University of New Orleans. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, where he lectures on civil liberties and philosophy of law. At Princeton, he's also the director of the Madison Program on American Ideals and Institutions, which is the inspiration for the Tocqueville Project at the University of New Orleans. Professor George is also the author of 16 books, and one of those books, an early one, Making Men Moral, was the book that introduced me to political philosophy and got me interested in what I'm doing today. And so I'm personally very pleased that he accepted our invitation here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert George.
Well, I want to say thank you to Chris for inviting me down. I also want to congratulate Chris on his bravery vis-a-vis his donors. If our libertarian friends at the Koch Foundation have ever read, or if they ever read that book you mentioned, Making Men Moral, you're going to be in big trouble for inviting me down here in their series. But we can keep a secret, right? Everybody, we can keep a secret. It's a pleasure to be down here, and wonderful to be meeting new friends in philosophy and in related fields. And such a joy to be here with Judge Joy Clement of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and Judge Marty Feldman from the District Court. I want to talk with you today about religious liberty and the human good. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to begin, it's that my philosophy friends here will back me up on this, with an occupational obligation to say something absolutely unintelligible in the first paragraph. So let me get through it. I promise that will be the end of it. I'll get through it, and then we'll go on to the stuff that I hope and trust everyone will understand. Whether you agree with it or not, you'll at least understand it. And I even hope in the course of the lecture to explain what I meant by the unintelligible stuff. So here goes paragraph 1. The starting points of all ethical reflection are those fundamental and irreducible aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons that some philosophers refer to as basic human goods. These goods, as more than merely instrumental reasons for action, are the very first principles of practical reason that control all rational thinking with a view to acting, whether the acts performed are in the end properly judged to be morally good or bad. The first principles of practical reason direct our choosing toward what is rationally desirable because humanly fulfilling and therefore intelligibly available for choice and away from their privations. It is in the end the integral directiveness of these principles that provides the criterion, or when specified the set of criteria, that is the moral norms, by which it's possible rationally to distinguish right from wrong, what is morally good from what is morally bad, including what is just and unjust. Morally good choices are choices that are in line with the various fundamental aspects of human well-being and fulfillment integrally conceived. Morally bad choices are choices that are not. Okay, we got through that. I've established to my friends over here that I'm an orthodox Aristotelian. Now, to say those very abstract things that I've just said is simply to spell out philosophically the point made by Martin Luther King in his letter from the Birmingham jail about just and unjust laws that honor people's rights and those that violate them. You will perhaps recall that the great civil rights champion anticipated a challenge to the moral goodness of the acts of civil disobedience that landed him behind bars in Birmingham. He anticipated his critics asking him a certain question. Now, the critics that Dr. King had in mind were not the bad guys. They weren't the bad segregationist, racist Jim Crow people. It's not who that letter's to. Go back and read that letter. It's very interesting. We all think that if Martin Luther King was writing a letter from the Birmingham jail where he was sharply critical of some people, those people must have been these dreadful racists. They weren't. These were ministers and a rabbi who were friends of civil rights, in some cases, active campaigners for civil rights. In one particular case, a very brave minister who had championed the desegregation of his church at great risk to him professionally and even personally. These people had their reasons, which are worth contemplating and taking seriously, for opposing Dr. King coming to Birmingham, bringing national forces to Birmingham to engage in protests that would foreseeably provoke violence, not to practice violence. King, of course, was a Gandhian, completely against violence. But knowing that it would provoke violence, which would then, of course, bring national attention to what was going on in southern cities like Birmingham, to the abuse of the civil rights protesters, including children, fire hoses, dogs, and so forth, forcing the hand, quite possibly, if all went well, of the Kennedy administration to take some steps that the Kennedy administration, looking to 1964, wasn't all that keen to take, knowing it had to take Texas as it had in 1960. So the argument that King's critics was making was an argument about the moral importance of obedience to law. It was a case against civil disobedience. So King didn't have an easy target here. He wasn't criticizing Bull Connor or George C. Wallace or, since I'm down here, Leander Parrott. He was criticizing ministers and a rabbi who were on his side in the civil rights issue, but not on his side on the civil disobedience issue. So King is anticipating a question he knows they're going to ask. And here's how the question goes by King's own account of it. How can you, Dr. King, engage in willful law-breaking when you yourself had stressed the importance of obedience to the law in demanding that officials of the southern states conform to the Supreme Court's desegregation ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education? Now let's listen to King's own words in responding to this challenge that he anticipates. King says, the answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral duty to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And there he's actually quoting St. Augustine. Now King, in his own voice, continues. What is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. I'm continuing now, quoting King. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority, unquote. So there's his answer. The duty, not just the right, the duty to disobey unjust laws. That's the ground of the defense of civil disobedience. So, according to King, just laws elevate and ennoble the human personality, or what King in other contexts refers to as the human spirit. Unjust laws debase and degrade it. Now, his point about the morality or immorality of laws is a good reminder that what is true of what is sometimes called personal morality is also true of what might be called political morality. The choices and actions of political institutions at every level, like the choices and actions of individuals, can be right or wrong, morally good or morally bad. They can be in line with human well-being and fulfillment, to put it in my terms, in line with eudaimonia in Aristotle's term, or they can fail in any of a range of ways to respect the integral flourishing of human persons, to elevate the human spirit. In many cases of the failure of laws or of policies or institutions to fulfill the requirements of morality. We speak intelligibly and rightly of a violation of human rights. This is particularly true where the failure is properly characterized as an injustice, failing to honor people's equal worth and dignity, failing to give them or even actively denying them what they are due. But contrary, in my opinion, to the teaching of the late John Rawls, the eminent Harvard philosopher, and the extraordinarily influential stream of contemporary liberal thought of which he was the leading exponent, I wish to suggest that good is prior to right and indeed to rights. And here's what I mean by that. Referring back to my idea of the integral human good, when specified as the touchstone of moral rightness, trying to give some content, some philosophical rigor to what Dr. King has in mind by the ennobling of the human spirit. To be sure, human rights, including the right to religious liberty, are among the moral principles that demand respect from all of us, including governments and international institutions, which are morally bound not only to respect human rights, but also to protect them. To respect people, to respect their dignity, is to, among other things, honor their rights, including, to be sure, the right that we're gathered together today to think about, that is, the right to religious freedom. Now, I hope it goes without saying that to honor people, when I say to honor people's dignity requires respecting their rights, giving them their due, that doesn't mean honoring or respecting whatever they happen to want to do. That raises a separate question, whether what they want to do is something they have a right to do. That question will be connected to a question about whether it's the right thing to do. Now, like all moral principles, human rights, including the right to religious liberty, are shaped and given content by the human goods they protect. So you see here I am rejecting, every bit as forcefully as someone like John Stuart Mill would, although from a very different perspective, since I also reject utilitarianism as a method of moral judgment. I'm rejecting the idea of purely abstract rights, the idea that people have rights that are unconnected to anybody's good or well-being or flourishing or fulfillment. Rights rather depend on, for their shape and content, a sound understanding of human well-being, human flourishing, Aristotle's eudaimonia. Rights, like other moral principles, not all moral principles are framed in terms of rights, but rights, like other moral principles, are intelligible as rational action-guiding principles because they are entailments and at some level specifications of the integral directiveness or prescriptivity of principles of practical reason that direct our choosing toward what is humanly fulfilling and enriching, or as Dr. King would say, uplifting, and away from what is contrary to our well-being as the kind of creatures we are, namely human persons. And so, for example, it matters to the identification and defense of the right to life that human life is no mere instrumental good, but is an intrinsic aspect of the good of human persons, an integral dimension of our overall flourishing, which is connected to the truth, or in any event what I take to be the truth, that human beings are not non-bodily substances, understood as the real persons, that inhabit and use non-personal or subpersonal bodies, as if our bodies were extrinsic instruments of our true selves. But rather, human beings are a dynamic unity of body, mind, and spirit, the body being part of the personal reality of the human being. But my point here is that it matters to the identification and defense of the very idea of the right to life, that it protects an intrinsic good of the human person. It's not just an abstraction floating free of any consideration of human well-being. And similarly, it matters to the identification and defense of the right to religious liberty that religion is yet another irreducible aspect of human well-being and fulfillment, a basic human good. Now, there's a controversial proposition for you, if ever there. We think the right to life is controversial, or the idea that life is an intrinsic aspect of the human good, or even an intrinsic part of the personal reality of the human being. Well, the idea that religion is a human good is obviously very controversial. My old friend, with whom I drank many coffees and ate many lunches when I was a graduate student, but also a lecturer, and so had senior common room status in New College at Oxford, Richard Dawkins, of course, would jump up on the table. I see none of you are up on the table yet. Would jump up on the table to say, he lies, when he says that religion is a human good. But I think that even Brother Dawkins would have to concede, at least I want to make an argument that I hope would make even someone like Brother Dawkins concede, that religion as I conceive it for these purposes of this argument, is a human good in precisely the sense that I indicated earlier. That is, an end or purpose that provides a more than merely instrumental reason for choosing or acting, an intelligible reason for choosing something, not merely as a means to something else, but as an end in itself, as an aspect of our well-being or flourishing, a constitutive aspect, not just something instrumental. But to make the case for that, we have to ask the question, what is religion? Well, in its fullest and most robust sense, religion is the human person's being in right relation to the divine, the more than merely human source or sources, if there be such, of meaning and value. Now, of course, even the greatest among us in the things of the Spirit, the Mother Teresas, the Gandhis, and so forth, fall short of perfection in various ways. But in the ideal of perfect religion, the person would understand as comprehensively and deeply as possible the body of truths about spiritual things, and would fully order his or her life and share in the life of a community of faith that is ordered in line with those truths. In the perfect realization of the good of religion, one would achieve the relationship that the divine, say God himself, assuming for a moment the truth of monotheism, wishes us to have with him. Now, of course, different traditions of faith have different views of what constitutes religion in its fullest and most robust sense. There are, obviously, different doctrines, different scriptures, different structures of authority, different ideas of what is true about spiritual things and what it means to be in a proper relationship to the more than merely human sources of meaning and value that different traditions understand as divinity. For my part, I believe that reason, our intellectual powers, capacities, has a very large role to play for each of us in deciding where spiritual truth most robustly is to be found. And by reason here, I mean not only our capacity for practical reasoning and moral judgment, practical reasoning again in Aristotle's sense, not pragmatic or instrumental reasoning about what is to be done, what ought to be done, reasoning on the basis of intelligible purposes. But also our capacities for understanding and evaluating claims of all sorts, logical, historical, scientific, and so forth. If one were trying to decide, should I join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, one would be looking not only at the moral teachings of the faith being proposed, but also at the logical consistency of the teachings. One would be looking at the historical claims that are made on behalf of the faith, and so forth. The same would be true if one were trying to decide whether to become a Catholic, if one weren't already a Catholic, or to join some other church, or to leave a religious tradition that one was, say, brought up in. But one need not agree with me about this high role of reason in the spiritual quest in order to affirm with me that there is a distinct basic human good of religion. Now, by a distinct basic human good of religion, remember, I mean that this good, this thing, this spiritual quest, this religion, can provide an intelligible reason for acting, whose intelligibility as a reason does not depend on its instrumental value or its utility or being a means to some deeper or further reason, which is the ultimate end. Rather, it's an end in itself. So one need not agree with me about this in order to affirm with me that there's a distinct basic human good of religion, a good that is uniquely architectonic in shaping one's pursuit of and participation in all the basic human goods, and that one begins to realize and participate in this good of religion from the moment one begins the quest to understand the more than merely human sources of meaning and value, and to live authentically by ordering one's life in line with one's best judgments of the truth in religious matters. So there are two claims built into that compact little statement there. One, that religion plays a kind of interesting and distinctive role. It's a human good that's different from a lot of other human goods, like the pursuit of intellectual knowledge for its own sake, reading Shakespeare or studying quantum mechanics, even if one doesn't have some instrumental goal for that, or the good of friendship, visiting a friend in the hospital who happens to be sick, taking over a friend's class one day if the friend happens to have a doctor's appointment and can't meet the class, or whatever. Religion plays an architectonic role. For the religious person, it doesn't matter what religion you belong to. This is true, I'm told, by my Hindu friends, as well as for Muslims and Jews and Christians and Sikhs and Baha'is. That phenomenon in one's life, that set of understandings, is something one pursues for its own sake, to be sure, but it plays this role in shaping one's pursuit of all the other goods. It's an organizing principle, provides an organizing principle or set of principles for one's life, a life of doing lots of other things that aren't themselves properly classified as the good of religion, but are pursued against a horizon shaped by one's fundamental religious understanding and stance. So that's number one. And number two, the idea that to embark on the quest itself is to begin to participate in that intrinsically fulfilling reality, that human good, which I'm labeling religion. That one's life would be missing something. It would be the poorer if one never asked the questions, if one never embarked on the quest, if one never began the seeking. And that's true no matter where one ends up, including if one ends up in atheism. Now, if I'm right, then the existential raising of religious questions, the honest identification of answers, and the fulfilling of what one sincerely believes to be one's duties in light of those answers are all parts of the human good of religion, a good whose pursuit is an indispensable feature of the comprehensive flourishing of a human life. That's what I meant a second ago when I said that a life would be a poorer life if it left that out. I mean, if you were doing all sorts of other wonderful things, you're reading Shakespeare and studying quantum mechanics, and you had lots of nice friends, and you did ballet, and you were good at chess, and you were interested in football, and all that other stuff, which is all great, and and a life would be poor if you didn't do that stuff too. But if you just completely left out raising those existential questions, those questions about what does it all mean, your life would be the poorer for it. A wise counselor, a life coach, would say, you're doing a lot of great things, but you ought to think about, I'm not telling you where to end up, but you ought to spend a little time thinking about what this all means and what makes everything else you do hang together. So if I'm right, human beings are, homo religiosus, to borrow a concept or at least a couple of words of Latin from Eliade, and the flourishing of man's spiritual life is integral to his all-round well-being and fulfillment. Now, this doesn't mean, don't take me to be claiming, because I'm not, that everyone's life should be dedicated to religious things, so that one's professional life should be in the religious domain, one's avocation should be in the religious domain. Not everybody has to be a priest or a nun or a Buddhist monk or anything like that. It's not part of the claim here. The claim is narrower, but still strong, I think, that it's an aspect of anybody's well-being and fulfillment, of their humanity, to at least consider those questions and to try to order one's life authentically, with integrity, in line with the best answers one comes up with, even if provisionally, holding open the possibility of revising one's views in the future, but living in line with them, living in a way that's an authentic way. I think someone like Camus, for example, could affirm that and would affirm that very gladly. But if that's true, then respect for a person's well-being, or more simply respect for the person, since to respect a person is to respect the person's well-being, demands respect for his or her flourishing as a seeker of religious truth and as a man or woman who lives in line with his or her best judgments of what is true in spiritual matters. And that in turn requires respect for his or her liberty in the religious quest, the quest to understand religious truth and order one's life in line with it, in a way that has integrity, a way that has authenticity, that's not a fake, that's not putting on a show for other people, that's for real. Now, because faith of any type, including religious faith, cannot be authentic, it cannot be for real, it cannot have integrity, it cannot be faith unless it's free. Respect for the person, that is to say, respect for his or her dignity as a free and rational creature, requires respect for his or her religious freedom. It's of the nature of faith that it can't be imposed. You can force somebody to go through the motions or to do what a religious person would do. You know, you can force somebody to open the Bible and look at the words, or even maybe read it or recite it back, or go to a church service. You can force someone to do the external stuff, but that's not faith. Faith is constituted by internal acts of reason and will, which are not reachable by external power. A coerced faith is a faith in those quotation marks. It's not real faith. Faith can't be coerced. The guy who says, gosh, I have to coerce this guy so he'll have faith, is just making a fundamental error. He's imagining something that's possible that is, strictly speaking, impossible. That's why it makes sense from the point of view of reason, and not merely from the point of view of the revealed teaching of a particular faith, to understand religious freedom as a fundamental human right. Though I should add that there are religious faiths that do proclaim the right to religious freedom on theological as well as on philosophical grounds. Interestingly and tragically, in times past and even in some places today, regard for persons' spiritual well-being has been the premise and motivating factor for denying religious liberty or conceiving of it in a cramped and restricted way. Before the Catholic Church, and I myself am a Catholic, before the Catholic Church embraced the robust conception of religious freedom that honors the civil right to give public witness and expression to sincere religious views, even when erroneous, in the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, some Catholics, including those speaking with authority within the Church, rejected the idea of a right to religious freedom on the theory that, quote, only the truth has rights, unquote. That was the slogan by which the opponents of the Church's embracing of religious liberty at the Second Vatican Council, in a robust sense. I mean, the Church had always taught that authentic faith can't be coerced. The real issue there was about the right to express one's faith in the public square, to witness to others, to evangelize, to proselytize, if you want to use that word, even in circumstances where, because of the politics of the day, the government was in a position to shut down that evangelization to protect, say, Protestant Christians, to protect against Protestant Christians trying to win Catholics over to Protestantism. So the argument was made, well, we can't embrace and shouldn't embrace a robust conception of religious freedom that will let that kind of stuff go on, because, after all, only the truth has rights. If we embrace the robust conception of religious freedom, we would be embracing the idea that error has rights, and error has no rights. So the idea was that the state, under favoring conditions, should not only publicly identify itself with Catholicism as the true faith, but forbid religious advocacy or proselytizing that could lead people into religious error and apostasy. Now, the mistake here that the church rejected was not in the premise, religion is a great human good, and the truer the religion, the better for the fulfillment of the believer. That's true. The mistake rather was in the supposition made by some that the good of religion was not being advanced or participated in outside the context of the one true faith, and that it could be reliably protected and advanced by placing civil restrictions enforceable by agency of the state on the advocacy of religious ideas. In rejecting this supposition, the fathers of the Second Vatican Council did not embrace the idea that error had rights. They noticed, rather, that people have rights, and they have rights even when they are in error. And among those rights, integral to authentic religion as a fundamental and irreducible aspect of the human good, the overall or integral human good, is the right to express and even advocate in line with one's sense, one's best judgment about one's conscientious obligations and what one believes to be true about spiritual matters, even if one's beliefs are in one way or another less than fully sound, and indeed even if they are false. Even those of you who are not Catholics have probably read in the paper over the course of the last year occasionally articles about negotiations going on between the Vatican and a group of breakaway Catholics led by some bishops who reject the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. There have been these negotiations. They go on for a while and then they break down, and then they get revived, and they go on for a while and then they break down, they get revived, then they go on and they break, and so forth and so on. And that's going on now. Well, specifically and primarily what they reject is this teaching about religious liberty. One bishop at the Second Vatican Council, Marcel Lefebvre, from, I want to say from France, but it might be from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, refused to go along with the robust conception of religious liberty because he thought it really did lead the church into the error of supposing that error had rights. He couldn't buy this idea that people have rights even if they are in error with respect to these religious questions, and those rights include the right publicly to express and advocate one's religious views. He actually had originally signed the document and then withdrew his signature. Then, after a few years, when the church did not reverse itself on that, Lefebvre took the decisive step of consecrating new bishops, which as a bishop of the Catholic Church, he was even one who was in bad standing, was able to do, which got him and the bishops that he consecrated excommunicated formally by the church and caused this whole controversy, which is still ongoing. The actual excommunications fairly recently were lifted so that these negotiations could go on. But the negotiations are not going anywhere, and the reason the negotiations aren't going anywhere, the reason they keep breaking down is this is the rock and hard place problem. The Catholic Church now has a conciliar teaching it cannot go back on, embracing the robust conception of religious liberty. The Lefebvreites have this view that the robust conception of religious liberty is a fundamental heresy. It's embracing the idea that error has rights. There's no room for negotiation. But I don't know why they keep going through the motions. The church hates schisms. I guess it's had enough bad experience with schisms over the past couple of thousand years. But it just doesn't look like there's any room for compromise here. Now, when I've assigned this document, Dignitatis Humanae, in courses addressing the question of religious liberty, and I've done that even for non-Catholic students because the argument that's put forward for religious liberty in the entire first half of the document is purely philosophical. In the second half of the document, there's a buttressing theological argument based on scriptural data and so forth that's adduced. But the whole first half of the argument, fundamentally making the case, is philosophical, and that argument is a philosophical argument, stands or falls on its own merits, and it's a really interesting argument. So it's really worth looking at, even in courses that aren't specifically coming from a religious perspective, any particular religious perspective. But when I've assigned that document, I've always stressed to my students the importance of reading another document of the Second Vatican Council, one called Nostra Aetate, together with it. Nostra Aetate was another document that caused a lot of heartburn among the Lefebvrites. And whether one's Catholic or not, I don't think it's possible to achieve a rich understanding of Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and the developed teaching of the Catholic Church on religious freedom, without considering what the Council Fathers proclaim in Nostra Aetate, which is the Declaration on non-Christian religions. One of the things that the Catholic Church faced up to at the Second Vatican Council was, what is our attitude, what is our stance, what is our understanding of non-Christian religions? Are they just totally wrong? Do they have nothing to contribute? Are they absolutely, thoroughly false? What is to be said about them? Well, in Nostra Aetate, the Council pays tribute to what it says, all that is true and holy in the non-Christian faith, implying and then explicitly saying that there is much that is good and worthy in non-Christian faiths, including Hinduism and Buddhism, which are addressed specifically, and especially Judaism, which gets a very long treatment, and Islam. In doing so, the Council gives recognition to the ways in which religion, even where it does not include the defining content of what the Council Fathers as Catholics believe to be religion in its fullest and most robust sense, namely the incarnation of Jesus Christ, enriches, ennobles, and fulfills the human person in the spiritual dimension of his being. And it's important, if you read the document, Nostra Aetate, you'll notice that the claim here is not just that the non-Christian religions have some good moral teachings. It does say that. But it pays tribute to the spiritual insights that are available to people in the great traditions that are outside of Christianity, such as Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam, and of course especially Judaism. A lot of people have heard of Nostra Aetate because of its treatment of the Church's relationship with the Jewish people, the long history of Christian anti-Semitism in which church authorities have lamentably so often themselves participated in past centuries. So people sometimes think Nostra Aetate is the document on Judaism. Judaism is given a special standing and a special treatment, but it's actually the document on the many great world religions outside of Christianity. And the teaching of the document is that these spiritual values in the non-Christian religions are to be honored and respected because the dignity of the human being requires it. Now, naturally, the non-recognition of Christ as the Son of God must count for the Church Father, the Council Fathers, as a falling short in the non-Christian faiths, even the Jewish faith, in which Christianity is itself rooted and which stands, according to Catholic teaching, in an unbroken and unbreakable covenant with God. Just as the proclamation of Christ as the Son of God, the very Son of God, must count as an error in Christianity from a Jewish or Muslim point of view. So, here, whichever side you're on, you got to count the other side as being in error on a really important point. I mean, you can't say, well, Jesus is the Son of God for the Christians, but he's not the Son of God. Because the Christian claim is the Son of God for everybody. He's the Son of God. You're either buy that or you don't buy that. There's no third position there. Yet, this does not mean, according to the Council Fathers, that Judaism and Islam, for example, are simply false and without merit, just as neither Judaism nor Islam teaches that Christianity is simply false and without merit. On the contrary, these traditions, according to the Council Fathers, enrich the lives of their faithful in their spiritual dimensions, thus contributing vitally to their fulfillment. So you see the Fathers avoiding religious relativism on the one hand. All faiths are the same, all faiths are true, and the only the truth has rights view, the view that says any religion outside of Christianity is nothing but false on the other hand. Now, I'm just using the Catholic Church as an example here. It's one that's familiar to me and maybe familiar to some of you. But the Catholic Church certainly has no monopoly on the natural law reasoning by which I am today explicating and defending the human right to religious liberty. The Catholic Church did not invent the concept of natural law. It's not an exclusive possession of the Catholic Church. But the Church does have a deep commitment to natural law reasoning, the idea that truths are available to our unaided reason and are not available only in revelation, and a long experience with it. And in Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council present, as I said before, a natural law argument for religious freedom. Indeed, they begin by presenting a natural law argument before supplementing it with that second half, the argument from Revelation that I mentioned before. So let me ask you to linger with me just a bit longer over the key Catholic texts so that I can illustrate by the teachings of an actual faith how religious leaders and believers, and not just statesmen concerned to craft national or international policy in circumstances of religious pluralism, can incorporate into their understanding of the basic human right to religious liberty principles and arguments available to all men and women of sincerity and goodwill by virtue of what Professor Rawls once referred to as our common human reason. Quoting him there. So let me quote at some length from Nostra Aetate to give you an appreciation of the rational basis of the Catholic Church's affirmation of the good of religion as manifested in various traditions of faith. And again, I do this in order to show you how one faith, Catholicism, can root its defense of a robust conception of freedom of religion not in a mere modus vivendi. Okay, well, look, let's agree not to fight each other or repress each other so that we'll have peace between us and we won't both end up the worse off for it. Or in a mutual non-aggression pact with other faiths, what the late Judah Schlar labeled a liberalism of fear. Or much less in religious relativism or indifferentism, but rather in a rational affirmation of the value of religion as embodied and made available to people in and through many traditions of faith. So here's what Nostra Aetate says, and let me here quote. Throughout history, even to the present day, there is found among different peoples a certain awareness of a hidden power, which lies behind the course of nature and the events of human life. At times there is present even a recognition of a supreme being, or still more of a father. This awareness and recognition results in a way of life that is imbued with a deep religious sense. The religions, which are found in more advanced civilizations, endeavor by way of well-defined concepts and exact language to answer these questions. Thus, in Hinduism, men explore the divine mystery and express it in both the limitless riches of myth and the accurately defined insights of philosophy. They seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God in confidence and love. Buddhism, in its various forms, testifies to the essential inadequacy of this changing world. It proposes a way of life by which men can, with confidence and trust, attain a state of perfect liberation and reach supreme illumination either through their own efforts or by the aid of divine help. So too other religions which are found throughout the world attempt in their own ways to calm the hearts of men by outlining a program of life covering doctrine, moral precepts, and sacred rites. The Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. She has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines, which, although differing in many ways from her own teaching, nevertheless often reflect truths which enlighten all men. Yet she proclaims, and is duty-bound to proclaim without fail, Christ who is the way, the truth, and the life. In him, in whom God reconciled all things to himself, men find the fullness of their religious life. I'm continuing now the quotation. The Church, therefore, urges her sons to enter with prudence and charity into discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians. The Church also has a high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has also spoken to men. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims link their own. Although not acknowledging Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. His virgin mother they also honor, and even at times devoutly invoke. Further, they await the day of judgment and the reward of God following the resurrection of the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. Over the centuries, many quarrels and dissensions have arisen between Christians and Muslims. This sacred council now pleads with all to forget the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding for the benefit of all men. Let them together preserve, promote peace, liberty, social justice, and moral values. And then it goes on with the famous treatment of Judaism and the Jewish people. Sounding in the depths of mystery, which is the church, this sacred council remembers its spiritual ties, which link it to the people of the new, covenant to the stock of Abraham. The Church of Christ acknowledges that in God's plan of salvation, the beginning of her faith and election is to be found in the patriarchs and in Moses and the prophets. She professes that all Christ's faithful, who as men of faith are sons of Abraham, are included in the same patriarch's call, and that the salvation of the church is mystically prefigured in the exodus of God's chosen people from the land of bondage. On this account, the church cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament by way of that people, the Jews, with whom God in his inexpressible mercy established his covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws nourishment from that good olive tree, Judaism, onto which the wild olive branches of the Gentiles have been grafted. Now, in my own voice, of course, from the point of view of any believer, any faith, any of those traditions we were just talking about in looking at the words of the council, the further away one gets from the truth of faith in all its dimensions, in its fullness, the less fulfillment is available. That's a logically necessary point. But that does not mean that even a primitive and superstition-laden faith, to take the extreme case, much less the faiths of what the Council calls those advanced civilizations, is utterly devoid of value, or that there is no right to religious liberty for people who practice such a faith. Nor does it mean that atheists have no right to religious freedom. The fundaments of respect for the good of religion require that civil authority respect and in appropriate ways even nurture conditions or circumstances in which people can engage in the sincere religious quest and live their lives authentically, reflecting their best judgments as to the truth of spiritual matters. To compel an atheist to perform acts that are premised on theistic beliefs that he cannot in good conscience share is to deny him the fundamental bit of the good of religion that is his, namely living with honesty and integrity in line with his best judgments about ultimate reality. Coercing him to perform religious acts does him no good, since faith really must be free, and dishonors his dignity as a free and rational person. So the violation of liberty is worse than futile. Now, having said all that, I want to acknowledge, of course, that there are limits to the freedom that must be respected for the sake of the good of religion and the dignity of the human person as a being whose integral fulfillment includes the spiritual quest and the ordering of one's life in line with one's best judgment as to what spiritual truth requires. Gross evil, even grave injustice, can be committed by sincere people for the sake of religion. Unspeakable wrongs can be done by people seeking sincerely to get right with God or the gods or their conception of ultimate reality, whatever it is. I have no reason to doubt that the terrorists who flew the airplanes into the buildings killing thousands of people on September 11, 2001, I have no reason to doubt that they were sincere in their religious faith. Utterly misguided, I have to believe, but sincere. It wasn't just a pretext. Aztecs who practiced human sacrifice. I don't have any reason to think that it was all a pretext for something else, as opposed to really trying to get right with divinity. But obviously, those kinds of things cannot be tolerated. The presumption in favor of respecting religious liberty must, for the sake of the human good and the dignity of human persons as free and rational creatures, be powerful and broad. But it's not unlimited. Even the great end of getting right with God cannot justify a morally bad means, even for the sincere believer. I don't doubt, as I say, the sincerity of those Aztecs, for example, or the sincerity of those in the history of various traditions of faith, including my own, who used coercion and even torture in the cause of what they believed was religiously required. But these things are deeply wrong and need not and should not be tolerated in the name of religious freedom. To suppose otherwise is to back oneself into the awkward position of supposing that violations of religious freedom and other injustices of equal gravity must be respected for the sake of religious freedom, and obviously that can't be right. Still, to overcome this powerful and broad presumption in favor of religious liberty, to be justified in requiring the believer to do something contrary to his faith, or forbidding the believer to do something that his faith requires, political authority must meet a heavy burden. The legal test here in the United States under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is presents one way of capturing the presumption and the burden. To justify a law that bears negatively on religious freedom, the judges will be my witnesses here that I've got the law right. To justify a law that bears negatively on religious freedom, even a neutral law of general applicability must be supported by a compelling state interest and represent the least restrictive or intrusive means of protecting or serving that interest. We can debate. Yeah, that's what you always like to see from the judge. Yeah, I like that. We can debate as a matter of American constitutional law or as a matter of policy whether it is or should be up to courts or legislators. That's an important decision that's got to be made. I mean, is it constitutionally, is it up to the courts or the legislatures to decide when exemptions to general neutral laws should be granted for the sake of religious freedom? That's what the famous Peyote case, Oregon against Smith, is all about. That's what Justice Scalia was interested in when he ruled that the Native American Indians have no First Amendment free exercise right to a conduct exemption to smoke their peyote, despite the fact that by every stipulation and every account, the Indians were in good faith. This was a bona fide religious ritual. They were not a bunch of hippies who made this religion up so that they'd go smoke dope or anything like that. This was part of their faith. They disciplined their members. They took care that no one would be injured as a result of people ingesting peyote. You weren't allowed to drive or operate vehicles after the religious ceremonies in which the peyote was rejected. And the church disciplined anybody who used drugs of any kind outside of the sacramental context. Now, the question there was not should, as a matter of justice or morality, the Indians be given a conduct exemption from a neutral general law against peyote smoking. Scalia and the dissenters all agreed that it would be perfectly legitimate for a legislature to decide that they should be given that exemption. Scalia's point was courts have no power under the First Amendment to impose that requirement on legislatures. It's up to legislatures. And by the way, after winning that case, Oregon, having proved its point, that the judiciary couldn't force it to grant a conduct exemption, that it was its constitutional authority to make the determination of whether a conduct exemption was required or not. After establishing its point, Oregon went ahead and granted the Indians a conduct exemption. So that's obviously a controversial question. Another controversial question is how to determine when the presumption in favor of religious freedom has been overcome. But the substantive matter of what religious freedom demands from those who exercise the levers of state power should be something on which reasonable people of goodwill across the religious and political spectrums should agree on, precisely because it's a matter capable of being settled by our common human reason. And actually, I think it's not that difficult a matter. Now, let me conclude with a few words about the centrality, and one might even say the priority, of religious freedom among the basic civil liberties. Observed from a certain perspective, any basic civil liberty, anything on that list that you find, for example, in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which is not a civil liberties thing, but or abridging the free exercise thereof, or the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, those kinds of things. Observe, from any perspective, any of those liberties might be assigned a kind of priority. Free speech, for example, which is so essential to the enterprise of republican government and, in truth, the good government of any kind, or freedom of association and assembly, or the right of self-defense in the Second Amendment, defense of one's family and one's community. One might, in the case of any of those liberties, say there's a kind of importance it has that makes it number one as a condition of the others. One might note in the case of any of these rights that its collapse would place the others in jeopardy. So I infer from this that there's certainly truth in the idea that civil liberty is a sort of seamless garment. Basic civil liberties support each other and in certain ways even depend on each other. Tyrannical regimes may begin by dishonoring one or a few basic liberties, but they get around in the end to dishonoring them all as the perceived interests of the rulers or the dominant classes incentivize them to do so. Still, there's a special sense in which freedom of religion has priority, or at least a sort of pride of place. It's rightly labeled in America the first freedom, not merely because it's listed first in our Bill of Rights, and not only because of its foundational historical role in the establishment of the conditions of free institutions, but even more importantly because it protects an aspect of our flourishing as human persons, which is, as I said before, architectonic in the way we lead our lives, has this organizing role in the way we lead our lives, helping to shape our pursuit of all the other aspects of our well-being and fulfillment that provide our most fundamental reasons for acting. Religion concerns ultimate things. In the focal cases, it represents our efforts to bring ourselves into a relationship of friendship with the transcendent sources of meaning and value. Our religious questioning, understanding, judging, and practicing shapes what we do not only in the specifically religious aspects of our lives, prayer, liturgy, fellowship, and so forth, but in every aspect of our lives. You ask a serious religious person, whether he is Hindu, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, Eastern Orthodox, LDS, you ask a serious religious person about some aspect of his life that seems just secular. He's a lawyer, or he plays golf, or whatever it is. He'll see it and present it and understand it himself as somehow fitting in to a life whose coherence is provided by his larger religious understanding, his world view. It helps us to view our lives as a whole and to direct our choices and activities in ways that have integrity, both in the moral sense of the term integrity and in the broader sense of having a life that hangs together, that makes sense, that is not just dilettantish. Now, as I hope I've made clear, religion is not the only basic human good. Nor would I necessarily say that in some ranking, in an absolute way, it's the most important, as if there were one that could be said to be the most important. That presupposes a kind of distinction among them that I think is incorrect. Nor are the other basic human goods, those besides religion, mere means to the fuller realization of the good of religion, which is a theological error sometimes people make, reducing everything else to the status of a mere means to the realization of this good. But having said all that, still, religion is an intrinsic and constitutive aspect of our integral flourishing as human beings. You want your kids, among other things, just think about it from a parent's point of view, those are your parents. You want your kids, among other things. Yeah, I mean, you want them to have good jobs, and you want them to know about Shakespeare, and you want them to have some skill in chess or music or be interested in football or ballet. But you want them to be the kinds of people who think about the big questions, who really think about what it means, and try to lead lives that have integrity in view of their fundamental beliefs. That's really the evidence that religion is an intrinsic aspect of our well-being and fulfillment. And it also plays, as I say, this shaping and integrating role with respect to all the other intrinsic and constitutive aspects of our well-being and fulfillment. Finally, there's the critical role of religion, and thus of religious freedom, in civil society in carrying out essential health, education, and welfare functions, which religions have historically done and continue to do to this day, and in limiting the scope of government and governmental power, something that the American experience has enriched our understanding of, and thus checking the power of the state, providing alternative authority structures to the unmediated power of the state. This is why sometimes the institutions of civil society, including religious institutions, are said to be mediating structures, mediating between the state, with its monopoly on violence and its profound power, and the individual. So religion provides authority structures, and where it flourishes and is healthy is among the key institutions of civil society, providing a buffer between the individual and the state. This is a vital way in which religion and religious institutions, when they respect the legitimate autonomy of the secular sphere, which they don't always do, and avoid illiberalism or time-serving subservience to the state, which has also happened in some cases, and theocracy, serve the common good. In the ideal situation, the religious institution respects the legitimate realm of the secular. This doesn't say that it never has anything to say about what goes on in the secular domain, but it respects the autonomy of the secular, and the state respects the legitimate domain and autonomy and integrity of religious institutions. Where that happens, the people are, on the whole, benefited. And in the face of tyrannical regimes, religion, if it can avoid corruption and co-optation, serves the common good even more dramatically by, for example, doing what the Catholic Church did in the face of communist tyranny in Poland, providing a rallying point, providing an institutional base, providing a moral and spiritual doctrine to enable the people to stand up against what was dehumanizing and oppressive. Religion can, in other words, contribute to both the theory and practice of resistance, but only where it's basically healthy, that is, uncorrupted, and capable of providing resources for prophetic witness. This is one more reason to cherish religious freedom, even while acknowledging that both good and bad can be done in the name of religion. Thank you. Questions? Shall I do some questions?
Yeah, time for questions.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so part of what I was getting is that you were defining religion as the existential questioning and conducting one's life in accordance with the results of the answers.
Not quite right, but close.
Okay.
That's where religion begins. That's
okay.
how religion begins. But I hope I was careful. I meant to be careful to say that in its fullest and most robust sense, religion is one's being in right relationship with the more than merely human sources of meaning and value.
Okay. So would dogmatic adherence to the rules of an organized religion without that existential questioning be part of this religious good, even if they were pursuing the actual truths?
Yeah, it'd be defective.
Okay.
And you know,
as defective as the non-pursuit by the...
As, I need to know
okay.
a lot more details than to say as. But the fundamental point that I think you're making, or at least your question is suggesting, is right. And the great spiritual teachers within the faiths have essentially made the same point. That if the faith creates, especially where the faith is dominant in the culture, and perhaps even exercising political power. So it's got its hands on all the levers. Where it creates a milieu which encourages conformism, mindlessness, how did I put it, time-serving obedience and so forth, it's going to damage the very good that the faith is supposed to advance, the good of that existential fulfillment, the good of the quest, the deep personal engagement with truths and leading lives that really have integrity. A life of just conformity, that's what I try to tell my students. There's so much conformism today. Say, look, you know, that's not a good life. Even if you're right, even if the stuff you're conforming to is right. You know, if you're just conforming, you're not thinking, you're just going along because it's politically correct. It's what everybody thinks. It keeps you friendly with your friends. It doesn't make you an enemy of anybody. Nobody looks down on you. It's hurting you. Break the conformism. And sound religion will teach that. St. Augustine will teach that. Gandhi will teach that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You've stirred up a lot of important questions in my mind. I want to start from your kind of playful, I think, remark in the beginning that you sort of passed the test of being an orthodox Aristotelian. But you know, as a starting point, what's interesting to me is you're using Aristotelian categories, the flourishing, the fulfillment of the human being, as the basis or source from which we can derive and justify rights. But first of all, this is the most superficial point, perhaps, but it's striking that Aristotle doesn't have a religious life.
Yeah,
but that's
I noticed that.
I mean, the more important, like the gist of all the many questions raised for me. I'm not sure how exactly you do want to differentiate religion from philosophy. And I suppose this is in a way another, you know, offshoot of the young man's question before, that and attached to that, maybe more essential for you is, where do you think we get the knowledge and understanding we have of what's required for human flourishing, such that you can claim, you know, religion is constitutive and is a constituent of it? Where do we get this knowledge, and what does religion add, or that philosophy doesn't have, or
Sure.
a lot of ways you could put that?
Oh, okay. Now, the beginning of my answer is, you know, how do I differentiate religion and philosophy? Not sharply. I would be an odd Catholic. Although today there are lots of odd Catholics. I would be an odd Catholic if I did distinguish religion and philosophy very sharply. Catholicism is a religion that has taken up the tradition of, and more than one tradition, traditions of philosophy into it. If you look around for Aristotelians today, you find a lot of Catholics, and the ones who aren't Catholic yet seem to be on the road. You know, Alistair MacIntyre, you know, embraces Aristotle, and the next thing you know, he's receiving communion. So, not sharply. The late Pope, Pope John Paul II, now blessed Pope John Paul II, wrote a wonderful encyclical on this called Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio in Latin. And his point was that in what he takes to be the truth of the matter, and therefore what the Church teaches and should teach, reason and faith cannot be sharply distinguished. It's not only that they're compatible, there's not a sharp line between them. They have a unity, and they need each other. They interpenetrate. Philosophy does work in theology. Try to do theology without philosophy. You'll end up with something that won't look Catholic. Try to do philosophy without theology? Well, that's more controversial, but the Pope says you put yourself at risk of making reason reason's enemy. That the danger of doing philosophy without faith is the danger of nihilism. Reason becomes the critic of reason, ultimately calling into question, in a radical sense, the validity of reason, reducing everything first to desire, a la Hobbes. The thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired, and ultimately to power. The Pope's really worried in the encyclical about everything being reduced to just power relations. Now, having said all that, obviously, if you go to a Catholic university, they've got a theology department and a philosophy department. They're not the same thing. Theology uses philosophical tools, always has, in the Christian tradition, And in the Jewish tradition, actually beginning at least with the Middle Ages. Yeah. So it uses the tools of philosophy, but theology uses the data of faith, most fundamentally the data of Scripture. Philosophy does not. And it's proper to philosophy that it not. Still, philosophy is often essential to understanding the data that theology works on. The only way you can understand the proposition which for Jews and Christians is revealed in Genesis 2, that the man shall leave his mother and home and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. The only way you can understand that is by doing the work of philosophy. There's simply no other way to do that. You have to figure out how can two distinct organisms be one flesh, one organism. In what sense could that possibly be true? Now, philosophy can actually shed quite a lot of light on that. But if you lay the tools of philosophy aside, you're just not going to... The most you're going to be able to do is sneak in a philosophical judgment and conclude it must be some sort of metaphor. It means that, a man and a woman, they're so emotionally close to each other that it kind of feels almost like they were physically united. But when you do philosophy, you'll see that a richer account can be given. And that's just one example of many that could be given. Is the reward between Athens and Jerusalem the kind of thing that Leo Strauss suggested very often in his writings without being ever settling it or being really ultimately clear about it? Do you kind of have to make a choice between Athens and Jerusalem? I say no. Lots of my non-Catholic friends who see philosophy the way I do say no to that question. So I think what's driving this train is a philosophical view. It happens to be in line with my religious view, and I'd sort of be in trouble as a Catholic if I had a different view. It would be a pretty good reason to start thinking about maybe why I shouldn't be a Catholic. But I really think that is a philosophical judgment.
One other thing which came out at the end of your talk, I was thinking perhaps you'd go along the lines that this civil political role of religion as an institutional phenomenon and as a mediating association, that sort of thing. Philosophy can't do that. Religion maybe can, and perhaps that's the political role, but I don't know how you put that together with the others.
I think that's important, but tertiary. And it's at the end because it's almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
Now, to say that kind of deprecates it in a way that I shouldn't. I mean, it's there because I do believe it. And I think there's overwhelming evidence, sociological evidence for it. But I think we would be making a bad mistake, and not only from a religious point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, to adopt the view that's often attributed, I think unfairly, but often attributed to neoconservatives, beginning with Irving Kristol, that they don't really think there's any truth to religion, but they think it's really socially useful to get people to do the right things. So it's social utility is what matters, not its truth. But for all the primary and secondary reasons I tried to outline before I got to the tertiary reason, I think religion and therefore religious freedom, serving the good of religion, is very important to human well-being, to human flourishing. And then on your very first point, to say that I'm an Orthodox Aristotelian is simply to say that it's not to embrace all of Aristotle's teachings. I mean, I think sometimes my wife thinks I'm a pagan, but I'm actually not. But it's to say that I don't believe in two things. One is the idea of abstract right. That there's what Mill called abstract right, that we have rights, or can know what's right, independently of a consideration of human well-being and fulfillment. So this is this point that I'm rejecting in Rawls about the relationship of the right to the good. And then secondly, I reject utilitarianism, or any form of consequentialism. So that I think that in trying to understand, in view of the diversity of human goods and the many, many different ways they can be instantiated by unlimited numbers of people, unlimited numbers of circumstances, what won't work is to propose a principle like choose the option or act on the rule that will, overall in the long run, produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm. So you reject those two, you end up with something like
Sure.
the Aristotelian position. Oh, yeah, how are you, McLean?
I'm wondering if you would give us your own brief history of the concept of rights, but knowing that the word itself, rights, is a relatively recent word, and that Homer didn't necessarily have his own concept of it, but also knowing that Homer began with something that we would translate as rights, but it would have been less abstract perhaps, and moving through time, the way Aristotle would have changed that view, and just give us your own extrapolation, I guess.
Well, I hear people say that.
And then also maybe ending with your good friend Brother Dawkins.
Oh, Dawkins. Oh, yeah.
What would he say a right is?
Okay.
And that's pure extrapolation.
Yeah. Well, I do hear people say what you said at the beginning all the time, that the word rights or the concept of rights is a modern development. Or
Word,
modern
is it? For sure,
invention.
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are concepts, terms, which in their context, in Roman law, and certainly in the medieval tradition, in the writings of Aquinas, that just sound like, to me, rights. They're almost always in a context where a proposition is being asserted about what is due to someone, where the perspective being adopted is the perspective of the beneficiary of the duty. And that's, I think, a pretty good account of how we use rights when we use it well in our contemporary discourse. It's looking at an obligation in justice from the perspective of the guy who is going to benefit from whatever the obligation, by not being killed or not being tortured or by positively being given some benefit.
Let me give you an example of what I'm driving at. I think in some translations of the first chapter of John, the verse would be translated, "To him he gave the right to become the sons of God." And the Latin word, I think, would have been dunamos.
That would be
That's
Greek.
where we get, that's Greek. Potestas, I think, would have been the Latin word. Anyway, I'm just curious about the different shades of meaning. What would it have meant to Homer, to Aristotle, to John, to so forth and so on? Because and I'm suggesting that it began in something that was solid and tangible, and that we have today started reifying the term to the point where it's no longer actually tethered to anything real.
Well, I think that there's not a single term that captures all the occasions on which I think a modern translator could legitimately,
Right.
and in some cases should, translate a term as right. There's not a single term, but the one that probably is the best candidate for most often is jus. This is the use gender.
Sure.
It may be true, and I'm not a good enough intellectual historian to be really confident about this, it may be true that the phenomenon that you're pointing to here, and probably rightly in my view, doing it from a critical perspective, is the linking of the concept of rights to expressive individualism. And where that happens, not as a matter of logical necessity, but as a matter of practical reality, people tend to lose their grip and the concept goes out of control. So people begin making mistakes like identifying a want with a right. That if I want something, I have a right to it. And the only way that my right to such and so can be trumped is if it conflicts with somebody else's right to something else. And now you're going to end up in a logically incoherent working. Not going to get anywhere. Number two, people begin to think of rights independently of duties and responsibilities. So not only does the people claim to have a right to whatever they want, nobody thinks about duties and responsibilities, but the concept of rights only makes sense in light of duties and responsibilities.
What do you think Brother Dawkins' unified field theory of rights might be?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, this is
I'm just
something
curious.
What I think is, I mean, what we never discussed, because I wasn't doing this stuff back then, and he wasn't doing, he was doing biology then.
Right.
You know. But to me, the interesting question is, wouldn't he go along, I assume he would, with my proposition that it is a good, at a minimum, it is a good thing. In fact, one might even say one has a moral duty. And Brother Dawkins is not averse to talking about moral duties, about evil. I mean, what's wrong with religion? It's evil. There's a moral, right? Right. So he's not embracing moral relativism or subjectivism or anything like that. So I think he would, I hope he would agree that not only is it a good thing, but maybe even we have a moral duty to raise those questions about what it all means, whether there are any sources of meaning and value beyond the human. And either way, what ought we to do? Shouldn't we lead our lives in a way that has integrity in light of our best judgments? Isn't that something good in itself? Even if it's not instrumentally good to something, like getting to heaven, or whatever it might be instrumentally good. And if he'll go that far with me, then I would want to say, yeah, but then, just humor me for a moment, Richard. But then, if you go that far with me, doesn't it have to be true that the fuller and better and richer and more accurate your understanding of the truth, whatever it is, and I'm not prejudging that, the better off you are in respect of that good, which I'm calling religion. You don't like the label, put some other label on, it doesn't matter. I think you have to go along with me on that. And then we're just in a debate about whether there are more than merely human sources of meaning, and if not, what follows from that, and if so, what follows from that. Okay?
One more?
Yeah. Oh, one more, yeah, I'm sure.
Oh,
How are you?
fine.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again. If you, well, let us grant that the idea of right is not a modern discovery or only found in modernity, but would you say that this notion of a right to religion is something that developed only within the modern period?
Oh. Well, if you actually you find in not only in but even in church fathers the idea that faith has got to be a free act, that there's something wrong with coercing faith. What they don't get to, and what you don't get to the modern period, with the Baptists leading the way, is the idea that, well, that's only a fragment of religious freedom in its full and robust sense. Abstaining from attempting to do the impossible, coercing faith, is part of the story, but only a little part. The recognition of liberty to act on one's sense of one's own obligation, one's conscience, one's own sense of obligation to share the truth as one sees it with others. This is what the hang-up was. This is what the debate was at the Second Vatican Council. The Catholic Church says, in the end, yep, that's got to be it. Even a Catholic state, which can get away with it, it has the physical, political, sheer power to shut down dissent, cannot do it consistently with dignitatis humanae, the dignity of the human being. You're violating the dignity of the Protestant dissenter or the atheist or whoever he is when you shut him down because he's leading people astray from Catholic doctrine. Now, as I say, Catholicism is actually coming late to the party. This is 1965. The Baptists had essentially articulated the same thing a couple of centuries, actually. Is that right? Yeah, very early on.
Well, do you think the Baptists were more important than Locke or, modern theorists of right, toleration?
I do actually. I mean, we tend not to read the Baptists in our political theory classes. We read Locke, but I can account for that in ways other than saying that's just obviously the right way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.